Continuing Chapter 7, The Sword Dance, from Jessie L. Weston's From Ritual to Romance. The Morris dances differ somewhat from the sword and mumming dances. The performances, as a rule, take place in the spring or early summer, chiefly May and Whitsuntide. The dances retain little or no traces of dramatic action, but are dances pure and simple. The performers, generally 6 in number, are attired in white, elaborately pleated shirts, decked with ribbons, white moleskin trousers with bells at the knee, and beaver hats, adorned with ribbons and flowers. The leader carries a sword, on the point of which is impaled a cake. During the dancing, slices of this cake are distributed to the onlookers, who are supposedly to make a contribution to the treasury. A money box carried by an individual, called the squire or clown, dressed in motley and bearing in the other hand a stick with a bladder at one end and a cow's tail at the other. In some forms of the dance, there is a lord and lady who carry maces of office. These maces are short staves with a transverse piece at the top and a hoop over it. The whole is decorated with ribbons and flowers and bears a curious resemblance to the crux ansata. In certain figures of the dance, performers carry handkerchiefs, in other words wands, painted with colors of the villages to which they belong. The dances are always more or less elaborate in form. The costume of the clown is an animal skin, or cap of skin, with a tail pendant, and the special character assumed by the Maytide celebrations in early parts of England, like Cornwall and Staffordshire, would seem to indicate that while the English Morris dance has dropped the dramatic action, the dancers not being designated by name and playing no special role, it has, on the other hand, retained the theriomorphic features so closely associated with Aryan ritual, which the sword dance and mumming play on their side have lost. A special note of these English survivals, and one to which I would now draw attention, is the very elaborate character of the figures, and the existence of a distinct symbolic element. I am informed that the sword dancers of today always, at the conclusion of a series of elaborate sword-lancing figures, form the petangle. As they hold up the sign, they cry triumphantly, "A nut! A nut!" The word nut, not, I thought they meant like the food, but, as in the game of nuts, breast knots, nosegays in May. They do this often, even while performing a latter part of the mumming play. I have already drawn attention to the fact in Gawain and the Green Knights, the hero's badge is the petangle or pentacle. There explained as by the English the endless knot. In the previous chapter, I have noted that the petangle frequently in the tarot suits replaces the dish. In Mr. Yeats' remarks cited above, the two are held to be interchangeable. One or the other always forms one of the groups of symbols. In one form of the Morris dance, that performed in Berkshire, the leader or squire of the Morris carries a chalice. At the same time, he hears a sword and a bull's head at the end of a long pole. This figure is illustrated in Miss Mary Neal's Esperance Morris book. See English Folk Song and Dance by Frank Kidson and Mary Neal, Cambridge. from 1915. And the plate facing page 104. A curious point in connection with the illustration is that the chalice is surmounted by a heart, and that the tarot suit's cups are equivalent of our hearts. The combination has now become identified with the cult of the Sacred Heart, but is undoubtedly very much older. And I commented on some guy's video about, well, how is Christianity distinct other than renaming things, or that they have combinations of the very same things that other groups had, material culture-wise. Couldn't thought, you couldn't think of an answer other than, well, we better look deeper. It's like, well, I watched your video. I don't see anything that you mentioned. Thus, our English survivals of these early vegetation ceremonies preserve, in a more or less detached form, the four symbols discussed in the preceding chapter. Grail, sword, lance, and pentangle are dish. It seems to me that in view of the evidence thus offered, it is not a very hazardous or far-fetched hypothesis to suggest that these symbols, the exact value of which, as a group, we cannot clearly determine, but of which we know the two most prominent, cup and lance, are to be sex symbols, were originally fertility emblems, and as such employed in a ritual design to promote or restore the activity of the reproductive energies of nature. As I have pointed out above, an obvious dislocation has taken place in our English survivals. Sword dance, mumming play, and Morris dance no longer form part of one ceremony, but have become separated and connected on the one hand with the winter, on the other with the early spring, nature celebrations. It is thus not surprising that the symbols should also have become detached. The fact that the three groups manifestly form part of an original whole is an argument in favor of the view that at one moment all the symbols were used together, and that the Grail chalice carried in a ceremony in which sword, lance, and pentangle were also displayed. But there is another point I would suggest. Is it not possible that in these armed youths, or in some cases, notably in that of the Salii, at once warriors and priests, we have the real origin of the Grail Knights? We now know absolutely, indubitably, that these sword dances formed an important part of the vegetation ritual. It is not exactly within the bounds a possibility that the general ceremony became elevated first to the rank of a mystery cult, as my stomach growls in anticipation, and thus used as a vehicle for symbolic Christian teachings. The figures of the attendant warrior priests underwent a corresponding change from Salii to Templars, is not, after all, so far a cry as from the glittering, golden-armed Maroots and the youthful, leaping Curetes to the grotesque tatterdemalion personages of the Christmas mumming play. We have learnt to acknowledge the common origins of these two latter groups. We may not reasonably contemplate a possible relation existing between the first two named.